afternoon. At least it's afternoon here in Washington, D.C., and Maryland and Virginia. We are so happy that you're joining us for this conversation on anti-racist educator professional development. My name is Janice View, and I'm here with my wonderful colleagues, Dr. Elizabeth DeMulder, Dr. Stacia Stribling, Laura Dahlman, and Laura Rodriguez-Gregg. You'll get to know them more as we go through this conversation. We each have a part to share. We will also leave plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. We also invite you in the course of the conversation to post questions in the chat, and we'll try to monitor that and be responsive. There will also be opportunities in the course of the presentation for you to give feedback, explicit feedback to us in the chat space. So consider this a conversation, and we, as much as we want to share, we want to learn from you as well. We like to start with a land acknowledgement. Land is not just merely a place that the body occupies. It's also a depository or repository of culture, story, history, and tradition. As such, we want to start our presentation by sharing a land acknowledgement statement for the land on which we have the privilege of living and working. At the place George Mason University occupies, we give greetings and thanksgivings to these Potomac River life sources, to the Doig ancestors who Virginia annihilated in violent campaigns while ripping their lands apart with the brutal system of African-American enslavement, to the recognized Virginia tribes who have lovingly stewarded these lands for millennia, including the Rappahannock, Pamunkey, Upper Mattapony, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Nansemond, Monacan, Mattapony, Patawomack, and Nottoway, past, present, and future, and to the Piscataway tribes who have lived on both sides of the river for time immemorial. Thank you. Next slide, please. So we are, I mentioned our names, and I recently retired from George Mason University. Betsy and Stacia are still work there as faculty. Laura is a doctoral student, and Lauren Rodriguez-Gregg is an elementary instructional coach with Loudoun County Public Schools, and a graduate of the program that we will be describing, and she will be sharing more deeply her experiences of that work. Next slide, please. So what is the context for our conversation, for the book we wrote? We teach in a master's degree program for practicing classroom teachers. It's intended to be a professional development program. And one of the things that was clear to us after sort of 20 years of doing this, more than 20 years of doing this work, is that teachers expressed some ideas about what was missing from high quality, what they believe is important for high quality professional development, and what seems to be missing from the experiences that they have. In addition to that, Virginia ranks 40th in terms of state funding for public education on a per pupil basis. And also Virginia's teachers are paid less than the national average. And so while teachers say things like, new information is important, immediate applicability of professional development is important, and something that's engaging for teachers, something that's rigorous, oftentimes that's missing from what's valuable to them. So I invite you in the chat to say something about what you think is missing from teacher professional development. And we'll give you a few seconds to write your thoughts. And because we're teacher educators, we know how to do wait time. So we don't mind the silence.
Oh, so, amen, Carrie, amen.
Right. So Carrie mentioned emotional intelligence and empathy content. Other thoughts and ideas? Pedagogical support for building engaged learners in a classroom. We'll take one more before we move on.
Sorry.
No problem. Cultural humility, yes, that's a really important piece. So yes, let's move on, Betsy. So again, based on our 20 years of experience, in asking that question, we got some of the responses that you saw on the slide and also some of the ones that you shared, maybe not so much in that same language. And so you'll notice that when people talk about what they think is really, really important, collaboration with colleagues, um, the opportunity for self-reflection, critical dialogue, the opportunity to create culturally relevant lessons is really important. Effective test preparation was not on the list. It was not perceived as essential to professional development, yet that's so much of what teachers receive. And so I see some other good comments. And this X survey was done a couple of years ago. So support in educational curriculum, trauma-informed educational practices, yes. Teachers are crying and have been for all of that. And so based on our experiences and based on the survey information that we received, we decided to write a book about our experiences and what we think can be helpful to others. And so on the next slide, there were 4 essential themes that emerged from the book that we will be talking about here today that seem to be at the root of high quality teacher professional development. So identity work, unpacking assumptions and taking action, the importance of relationships, and also a focus on policy. So now I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Hi, this is Stacia Stribling. I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about this first theme that Janice mentioned. We base some of our work in part, we've been influenced by the work of Ibram Kendi, and he reminds us that racist and anti-racist are not fixed identities, that we can be racist one minute and an anti-racist the next. So in other words, this work is ongoing and it requires constant reflection on the self. We need to be aware of the identities we claim related to things such as race, gender, ethnicity, language, etc., and how these complex interconnected identities drive our worldviews, our dispositions, our behaviors, attitudes, and actions. And it's also imperative that we deepen our understanding of the role our experiences play in shaping these identities, and ultimately how these identities that we bring to our classroom then impact students' learning. So through this deep reflexive process, we can become more aware of the ways in which our actions in the classroom either are or are not supporting anti-racist policy or expressing anti-racist ideas. So we do engage first with identity work with our teachers, and recognizing positionality challenges our teachers to notice their privilege and to understand the ways in which racism is still permeates our institutional structures and policies. And because teachers are at different places in their own development, we as instructors have to be prepared for all of the different responses we may get to this curriculum, right? So commensurate with the numbers at large in schools in the US, the majority of teachers in our program are white, middle class, females, and that's who we see often in our classes. And so sometimes we will have white teachers who have been engaging in self-reflection for some time and embrace this opportunity that we have for them to continue to do the work. We also work with some white teachers who've been operating under the assumption that being colorblind is the best way to address, or to rather not address, issues of race in their classrooms. The teachers of color that we work with, some of them contribute life experiences that reflect deeper understanding of their positionality and of the broader racist system in which they live and work. But there are also some who have internalized their oppression and that cling tightly to the assumptions and practices embedded in hegemonic structures. So regardless of where the teachers are when they come into our program, our goal is to grow their capacity as anti-racist teachers, and focusing on themselves allows them to examine their own implicit bias that impacts who they are and how they operate within their classroom and school settings. So we do embed self-reflection throughout the 2-year program, but we started out in the beginning with very intentional activities in our very first initial face-to-face summer course. And we are intentional in naming the scaffolding that we put in place, explaining the importance of knowing and understanding oneself before being able to know and understand and teach others. I am a former elementary school teacher, and from my own experience with teacher professional development, most of those opportunities dive right into teaching strategies, right? How do I teach fractions to kids in a way that's engaging and fun? How do I bring in more science experiments to get them to understand science concepts? But unfortunately, these strategies too often focus on what needs to be taught without consideration for who is being taught and who is doing the teaching, or the larger context in which the knowledge we're tasked to teach is actually constructed. So starting with identity, therefore, is really important to us. Some of the activities that we do are an identity web, and that's what you see in this picture here. We have them sort of fill out who are they and how do those pieces of their identity that they have identified on that sheet, how does that shape their worldview? It's a tough activity for most teachers. And so I would say with each of these activities, we continually revisit them. It's not a one and done. It's a let's start this conversation and we'll circle back to it. We also do personal photo narratives. This is based on the work of our colleague, Christian Zenkoff at Mason. He does a project through students' eyes with high schoolers, where he has them answer 3 questions about schooling through photography. And we do that with our teachers. We ask them things like, what it was the purpose of school for you, what helped you succeed as a student, and what got in the way, so that they start thinking about their own identity as a learner to understand how that shapes who they are as a teacher. We do activities around racial identity development, looking at rubrics to figure out where they are in their own racial identity development. Activities where they're reflecting on times when they've been marginalized or times where they felt they have mattered. And we also include lots of websites and videos as the basis of a lot of our conversations. I did want to share, we have Lauren speaking later, and she's a former student of ours who will have lots of examples of her experience, but there's this one quote from a teacher that I think is really telling about where we are in terms of teacher professional development and where we really need to be. She writes, "At first, I did not understand what this identity web was or how it related to this graduate program. I thought I was here to learn how to be a better teacher. However, I soon realized that this web was such a powerful tool in understanding how I view the world through my own lens. Once I realized that I view the world a certain way because of my own experiences and identity, I could realize and understand that my students see the world completely differently than me. This allowed me to make my teaching more student-centered and democratic. I started asking my students their opinions instead of putting my opinions on them. I started asking myself, why do they not understand this concept? What can I do to help them? Instead of asking, they should understand this. What is wrong with them? This has allowed me to become much more compassionate and understanding." So that quote, it's interesting that learning how to be a better teacher was not initially connected to who she was or how she viewed her students. And I think this happens with a lot of professional development. When we minimize teaching to strategies and fun and engaging lessons, then we miss the whole point of what an anti-racist democratic education is meant to be. And one last thing, one of the greatest benefits of the identity work we incorporate into the curricular experiences is the groundwork that it lays for developing a community of learners who trust each other with their stories, their successes, and their struggles. We believe it's not possible to become an anti-racist educator and do the work of anti-racist teaching in isolation. So the greatest hope for doing this work well lies in the communities we build that allow a space for respectful sharing, agreeing, disagreeing, challenging, growing. And it is by knowing who we are, stepping outside of ourselves and seeing the world through each other's experiences, that we can begin to develop our critical consciousness. And at that, I'm going to turn it over to Betsy, which rolls into our next theme.
Right, but first, we'd like to ask you to answer this question. So is there a part of your identity that's important to you that's often overlooked or not seen by others? If you could answer that in the chat.
Being an introvert. We talk a lot about personality preferences as well. Yes. My faith, religious traditions. Absolutely.
Being biracial, yes.
Okay, Betsy.
Okay. So as Stacia said, the identity work sets the stage for teachers to take seriously the multiple ways we can view and understand the world, and to use those multiple perspectives to unpack and carefully examine assumptions we hold, especially about teaching and learning. And as this little picture depicts, we often have assumptions about things, and assumptions are good to have. They keep us safe, they guide us through life. We assume that we can't walk out into the middle of a street without looking both ways. So assumptions aren't by nature bad, but the unexamined assumptions can also get us into trouble when there are things about our world that we have biases about, or incomplete information about, and we jump to conclusions without really thinking through. So that can be a dangerous situation as well as problematic in many cases. So this graphic is taken with his permission from Stephen Brookfield's book called Becoming a Critically Reflective Teacher. We use this model as a foundational exercise to carry forward throughout our work with teachers. It highlights the need to build understanding through evidence from many sources, and to consider how power and hegemony come to play in our understandings. And it looks a little bit confusing, but we study it and figure out what it is we're trying to get at here, looking at the different kinds of assumptions that you might have, and then thinking through different lenses how you can unpack those. Teachers tell us that these efforts help them develop a critical stance, priming them to ask critical questions and to begin to root out and address racist attitudes, practices, and policies, including the myth of colorblindness that Stacia was talking about. So we start to ask questions like, what knowledge and whose perspectives are privileged in my classroom? Who's benefiting from my instruction? Whose voice am I hearing? Whose voice is silent or silenced? How can I include the voices, knowledge, and experiences of all my students? So we also build knowledge of different theoretical frameworks and approaches, including critical pedagogy and culturally relevant pedagogy, to help teachers become aware of and act on the ways that institutional racism pervades schools and society, and the ways we're all complicit in perpetuating racism in some ways. We shift the focus of oppressive educational challenges from individuals to systems of oppression. And most importantly, we focus on informed action. Teachers develop the knowledge and skills to advocate for and take action for anti-racist attitudes, policies, and practices using critical inquiry tools. For example, they conduct an equity audit of their schools and classrooms that tends to highlight inequities in policies and practices. So for example, revealing inequitable representation of particular subgroups in advanced academic programs, for instance, programs that depend on teacher recommendations and test scores, and those can raise concerns, for example, about implicit bias. Teachers then conduct action research projects throughout the 2-year program that address the inequities they've identified and the teaching and learning challenges they face. So all of the program experiences support our teachers to model anti-racist attitudes and actions that supports their own students to develop as critical, anti-racist, and engaged citizens. So it's a tiered approach that we try to model what we preach. We ask teachers to also learn those skills and to use them in their own classrooms so that their own students are seeing an engaged, critical person who's helping them to become that engaged citizen as well. So all of this work depends on relationships, as you might have guessed or understood, and Laura's going to talk about that more.
Now, do you have a question to ask before I begin?
No.
Oh,
Nope.
okay. All right. I'm going straight into it then. So I'm then going to talk about relationships and the importance of them to the transformative work that the instructors do with their teachers, and that then the teachers do with their students. You know, as Stacia and Betsy, the work that they both described that they do, that's hard work. That identity work, that critical reflection on yourself and your own assumptions and the assumptions of the context within which you work and live, that's hard work. It's kind of scary work. And as Stacia said, it's best done within a community of practice, within a community of people. Because what happens in the transformative program, or what we hope happens, is that people are transformed. They're not just educated. We're asking them to revise the way they are in the world. We're asking them to re-examine their identity. We're hope to guide them to review their assumptions and critically review them. And that isn't something that people naturally do. And it needs to be done within the context of a community of practice where everybody is doing that, to be able to support and challenge as well each other, so that they can make the growth that they have to have. The number of things that well, let me go, the importance though then of doing that then for our teachers then translates, we hope, into being transformative for their students. Their students, of course, that's the ultimate goal, is then having to navigate their own identities. And especially if they come from different races, different ethnicities, different cultures, as they try to navigate and integrate their own identity pieces into an integrated whole. And it's the teacher who has done their own work in the context of the community and in the relationships that can facilitate, and through her relationship to students, facilitate kind of a healthy integration and self-acceptance and understanding of their own identity. So the relationship is central to that. The way that the group does this in the transformative teaching program is the importance to start is of establishing trust, of people feel safe to ask the hard questions. And that they can ask, the hard questions, sometimes maybe what feels like, the uninformed questions. And so the instructors are very deliberate about being explicit that it's okay where you are. Everybody comes at a different place. We're not necessarily expecting you to be, somebody, everybody to get, to this, glorious end goal, but that we hope that everybody engages in the process, and that the engagement and doing the work is the goal. So along with that, they also tell them that it is hard work. They don't sugarcoat it, and they tell them that it is a journey. They de-emphasize grades, as one way to make sure that it doesn't feel as threatening. It feels safe, that it's a journey and transformation is the goal. They also, though, just making them feel safe doesn't make them feel just, oh, we're all wonderful, and keep them all cozy where they are, but then also then to challenge them then within that context, and then to support them though as they do it, as they take on those challenges of identity and critical reflection. One way that they help to establish those relationships in the program too is they also all team teach every class. This is in combination with the fact that the cohort, the students or the teacher students, all go through every course together as a cohort. So those relationships, everybody begins the journey together, all instructors together, and they all move through the course together sequentially. So everybody's really a part of a community of practice. And then there's also then the emphasis, of course, also to have them then work together, and a big effort then to establish the relationship among the students, the teacher students. Another big variable I think that comes into this, before I stop and ask my question, is that our teachers are practicing teachers, so that as they do this work, they're able to go back to their educational settings, whatever role that they have, and practice it, and then bring it back to the transformative teaching community of practice to reflect and then grow from there. So relationships are really central. We know that they're central to learning generally, but especially to a transformative teaching program. So I'll leave it there, and then I will go on and have my own question, which is, go to the next slide. Yeah, thanks. And you can just answer in the chat. What are some things that you've done in whatever setting you are, an educational or an educator or an educational setting, to build relationships? And go ahead and put that in the chat. Oh, I see some good questions here, which I wasn't looking because I was busy talking. How do you make people actually feel safe? And I think then I see your question, Marina, about feeling safe, and then also about trust. So in the beginning of the program, there is a lot of work, just kind of team building, group building, getting to know, and also trust building, working together, and then trust building exercises, encouraging them, making them, first of all, putting out the expectations that this is hard and that it's okay and that we're here. I mean, being explicit about that. And then actually modeling kind of maybe your own vulnerability, so that you build then a community of trust. And then once people begin to risk, they then support each other, and then that trust is reinforced and that sense of safety is reinforced.
And I think too, it's important to say that we do build this community with the belief that we are going to have uncomfortable conversations, and people are going to feel discomfort, and being comfortable, or at least accepting of the fact that some of the conversations are going to be difficult, and we may say the wrong thing sometimes, and then we say, we apologize, or somebody else helps us understand what it is that was problematic. There's sometimes a lot of ouches going on, so that people are sort of called to task to recognize when they're saying things that are hurtful or wrong, or other people have different perspectives, and we encourage that kind of sharing of multiple perspectives.
And Stacia, I see you've also made an answer, make sure to name and to always make the power dynamic visible in the relationship then as well.
Yeah, and I appreciate, I had just responded to Rebecca, who talked about modeling that vulnerability. And we do that too. We share our own journeys because we're still on those ourselves.
Right.
And so talking about where we've been, where we are at the moment, where we feel we still need to go, shows them that we are works in progress as well. And yeah.
And to that point, just very quickly before we move on, we didn't magically start out being an anti-racist teacher professional development program 20 years ago, or more than 20 years ago. It's been an evolution, and maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we sort of said, wait a minute, we've been talking a lot about multiculturalism and social justice, but we've never said race head on. We've never said, what about this superstructure that's governing and influencing all of us and showing up in teachers' classrooms? And why don't we just name that explicitly? And why don't we change some of our assignments and change some of our what was that?
Course titles.
Course titles, yes, right.
Our language.
Right, and the language to reflect that. And so, you know, programmatically, we've been changing the way we do our work, but even internally, in terms of who we are as people, you know, we continue to learn every day. And so it's a journey. Are we here already? Okay.
We are here.
We are here. Okay. I will move through this quickly because we really do want to hear from Lauren and her experience of the program. It's one thing for us to talk about it, and it's another thing to talk with somebody who's been through it. And so the final piece, the final theme that we think is really important in this program is teacher leadership and policy. And you see a group of our teachers out in front of the Supreme Court. Back in the days before the pandemic, in our second summer, teachers would either go to Capitol Hill or they would go to the Richmond State House and engage directly with elected officials and policymakers. And they would often be very nervous about it and say, but I am not a policymaker. I've never met my elected official before. I don't know anything about educational policy. And then they walk in the room to talk with even their elected official who might know a lot about education policy, but they'll realize, wait, I know at least as much, if not more than this person, about how these policies land in classrooms, on kids, on teachers, how they affect our daily lives, how they affect curricula, et cetera. And so it becomes a week of empowerment, not just through those engagements with elected officials and policymakers, but also through other kinds of activities we do during that week to build a greater sense of their own leadership in policy. If you've read the Kendi book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, one of the things he talks about explicitly is that racism and anti-racism are manifestations of policies. And when we were putting the book together and his book came out, we thought, okay, what's the intersection here, especially since we claim to care about policy? And we talked about what we call little p policy and big P policy. Big P policy is the kind of thing that shows up on Capitol Hill or in the Richmond State House. It's, you know, sort of the legal policies. It's the budget authority. It's whether or not you have a gifted program or not, or charter schools in your district. The little p policy are the things that show up in your classroom, in your schools, that you can have direct impact and influence on, right? And to the extent possible, you can also engage with the big P policy stuff, but it's sort of a way of demystifying for educators, no, you can do policy work, and here's how, and here's how. So we took Kendi's 11 ideas about policy and matched them with some little p, big P policy ideas. So for example, identifying racial inequality in all of its manifestations. We do an assignment called an equity audit that looks at the data that represents your school. How many kids, what's the racial composition, how many of them are in special ed programs, how many of them are English language learners. Of those English language learners, how many of them are in gifted programs? You know, so we do this sort of quantitative analysis. to help people, and that's okay, Betsy.
Sorry.
To help people, get a better picture of their school. And oftentimes teachers will say, "Gosh, I thought my school was a blue ribbon school. We thought we were doing everything right. We have all the best test scores, but we're seeing that there are these inequities that we've never noticed before." And so now the next step after you do the audit is, what do you do about it? And part of the assignment is that teachers then have to figure out what to do about it in their classrooms, in their school, and maybe even in their district. And so an example on the next slide is of a policy pamphlet that some of our teachers put together when they were making these legislative visits. They thought about what's an issue of deep concern to us. And the other thing we didn't say is that our teachers are all grade levels, all subject matter, right? And so we'll have a kindergarten teacher and an AP calculus teacher all in the same cohort, right? And sometimes they'll think, oh, we don't really have anything in common, but this is an example where a group of teachers said, oh, actually, we do care about this particular issue, for example, and we want to figure out what our policy position is on this, and then be able to share with our elected official what needs to change. So these are just examples of teacher leadership and policy. There are others, and I won't bore you because it's time now to hear from Lauren Rodriguez-Gregg, who is one of our alum. She's an elementary instructional facilitator and coach. She's an equity lead, a former elementary teacher, graduate of our program in 2018, and as she always likes to remind us, a lifelong learner. And so Lauren, you take it away.
Thanks, Janice. And so speaking of lifelong learning, I am here to tell you a little bit about my journey. So at its very simplest and most powerful level, education is really about seeing the kids before us. It seems so simple and so obvious, yet often other times and other things get in the way. So things like curriculum, testing, data, planning, evaluations. And Betsy, Stacia, Janice, and Laura just talked about this work being a journey. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that journey and how I have been stepping out of my comfort zone to explore the themes that they just talked about. So on this slide here, you can see some pictures of my family. I was raised in a multicultural and bilingual home, surrounded by literature, love, different languages, and lots of learning. My parents worked very hard to instill in me from a young age the value of open-mindedness and acceptance for others, and every day showed me the magic of being around those who are different from me. I wanted to go into the teaching profession so that I could instill these same values in my future students. Next slide, please. When applying for teaching jobs right out of college, it was important to me that I work at a school that served a diverse population of students and families. And I felt very honored to begin my teaching career at a Title I school in Fairfax County. During my first few years of teaching, I discovered that learning happens only when strong relationships are built and when the classroom feels safe and supportive for students and their families. I learned that relationships like these take time. So with my students, I implemented strategies from responsive classroom, including morning meeting, different types of teacher language, closing circles, and activities dedicated to community building. So here on this slide, you can see my students cheering each other on during team relay races, tug of war, and greeting each other with a puppet. So this is one way that we fostered psychological safety in the classroom. For my students' families, I wrote weekly newsletters, offered optional weekend field trips, served as a spectator at games and recitals, opened my classroom to their visits, and offered much of my time outside of the school day to communicate with them. I learned that building these relationships can present challenges that took me outside of my comfort zone. I'll never forget a conference I had with a parent who did not speak English and an interpreter who did not arrive on time. I used my rusty Spanish to communicate with the parent about her child's successes as well as areas for growth. And I learned that by stepping outside of my comfort zone in that instance, I created a safer space for that parent and that student. As all in education have experienced and know, the end of each school year is always bittersweet. So bitter in that I had to say goodbye to students and families with whom I'd formed strong connections, and sweet in that I knew my students were ready for what was to come, academically and oftentimes, more importantly, socially and emotionally. Next slide, please. So when I learned about the Transformative Teaching Program at George Mason through an email from my principal, I knew it was the right program and the right time for me. I started this program during the summer between my 4th and 5th years of teaching, and I didn't realize it at the time that life would never be the same, and I've also never looked back. Next slide, please. So on the first day of class, like Stacia talked about, we started to unpack the concept of identity, something I realized I hadn't really put much thought into. So at that time, I knew that being a female meant something to me, and I identified with being a Cuban American, but I never really considered what that meant for me as a person or educator, friend, family member. We did an identity web that day, and we read about racial identity development. I really had no idea that there was so much that went into the makeup of our identities. So I reflected on this activity that week, and here's an excerpt of what I wrote. Next slide, please. I'm just a person. While I know my race is white, I also feel that my color doesn't define me. I'm just a person, and others around me are just people too. I remember growing up and learning from an early age that the way we look, the food we eat, the traditions we practice, and the beliefs we hold, and the way we dress don't define a person. A person is defined by their actions, words in whatever language, dispositions, and relationships with others. So at that time, I really had been transformed around the concepts of racism and racial identity. Now, almost 5 years later, I'm even more transformed, and I occasionally cringe a little bit when I read this because I know now that my race is a huge part of who I am. It's privileged me in ways I may not ever know, and my dispositions, actions, language, and character come second when meeting someone new. It's taken a lot of time and deep reflection to learn about and accept these things. Next slide. So at the beginning of the transformative teaching, despite the way I was raised to value diversity and inclusion, I thought that going into my classroom with a somewhat colorblind approach was the respectful thing to do. And we heard a little bit about that a few minutes ago. I talked with my students about how being different is wonderful, and we read stories like the ones on the slide here, whoever you are and same but different. But I didn't really go much further than that. And I learned very quickly in the program that I was, in fact, further marginalizing the already marginalized groups in my classroom by overlooking and possibly at times ignoring their histories, experiences, and perspectives. We learned in class that many white teachers hold this ideal that colorblind teaching is the right way or the way to go because talking about race can be so uncomfortable. Next slide, please. So once again, I stepped outside of my comfort zone in the classroom to deliberately engage my young students in identity exploration themselves. You can see here some of their identity posters. Not only did I discover that it wasn't as uncomfortable as I thought it might be, but I also saw the impact of this work. Students were thrilled to learn that they were from the same country as someone else, or that they had a similar hobby, or spoke the same language at home. And the relationships that we had already formed in that classroom throughout the school year were made infinitely stronger just in that one day. Okay, next slide, please. So this is a very busy slide. You'll have a moment to read it. So now, as the instructional facilitator, coach, and equity lead at my school, I collaborate monthly with a group of teachers on the equity committee. This is the first year that our school has an official equity committee, and the teachers who are members of it are very passionate about this work. During a recent committee meeting, teachers engaged as students in a lesson around identity, and they reflected on the possible impact of doing something like that in their classrooms. So here on this slide shows some of their initial thoughts and reactions after their experience. So I'll give you just a couple moments to read through some of their thoughts. So the committee members were asked to bring this idea of doing an identity lesson with their students back to their teams, and then all classroom teachers were invited to engage in this work with their students. So this was a baby step, and it's really exciting to share that we've already seen a big shift in the thinking on the part of many teachers. So I'm going to share with you a few of the reflections teachers shared after they implemented their lesson with their students. Next slide. I used to think my students would be unable to fully understand a lesson centered around identity. Now, I think the lesson gave my students an opportunity to connect through their similarities and differences. Next slide. I used to think you don't talk about race and differences. Now, I think you can do it without offending others. I used to think my students were too young to talk about identity. Now, I think talking and learning about identity is an integral part of your classroom community. It needs to be incorporated into daily conversations in an authentic way. I used to think elementary students only attributed parts of their identity to their personalities or interests. Now, I think elementary students have a broader understanding of their identity, specifically in regards to their beliefs and how they see the world. And this is the last one, I believe. I used to think that students already knew who they were. Now, I think students are still figuring it out and are also changing over time. And the list goes on and on and on. So by continuing to explore my own identity development and providing opportunities and space for others, students and colleagues alike, to explore theirs, I'm getting closer to seeing the kids, seeing their families, and seeing my colleagues. Next slide. So before we move on, we do have a little question for you to share in the chat. What might identity work look like in your own setting? So take just a moment to think about that question and share some thoughts in the chat. So creating a space where team members can share life stories, focusing on family history. So Rebecca, it sounds like you are already doing this, spending some time at the beginning to reflect and connect in that way. Yeah, something super powerful that can be done really quickly also is having people share the story of their names. That can be a really great way to do that as well. So if you haven't shared your idea yet, you can feel free to share and we're going to keep going. So next slide, please. All right, so this brings me to my next big aha I experienced along my journey. Betsy, Janice, and Stacia challenged us to explore the concept of assumptions, like Betsy talked about a little bit ago. And as you can imagine, this really was not easy. We dove really deep into perspective work, we uncovered our own biases, and learned the importance of examining and unpacking our own assumptions. Next slide, please. So here's that same graphic that you saw a moment ago. We learned about different types of assumptions and engaged in the critical reflection process here. And it was hard to admit that I made assumptions about students, parents, colleagues, family members, and at the same time, by having the space to admit this to myself and to my transformative teaching cohort, I was able to grow. So that's a perfect example of my journey not being so pretty all the time. The relationships fostered within my cohort made it feel okay to share things that I wasn't proud of. So in the program, we did more than just learn about the concept. We dove deep, we challenged ourselves and each other, and we came out on the other side more conscious and aware. The learning I experienced in the program very quickly trickled into my daily teaching practices and interactions with others at school. So at first, I'd sort of catch myself thinking or saying something assumption-wise about a student, colleague, or parent, and I would kind of privately check those assumptions. Then I began to acknowledge my own assumptions out loud to my teammates. And as time passed and this practice became more of who I was, I began to gently challenge these statements when they were said by colleagues. So now, almost 5 years later, I still make assumptions and I still have to check myself, and I'm just more comfortable with it because it's part of life now. So as a coach, I do my best to always presume positive, and if I hear someone say something that might stem from an unchecked assumption, I remind myself to ask mediative questions and respectfully engage them in dialogue around the topic. So by examining my assumptions, I'm giving myself a better chance of really understanding the kids, their families, and my colleagues. Next slide, please. So in the Transformative Teaching Program, my colleagues and I learned about the action research model and what it looks and feels like to enact an inquiry stance in the classroom. We engaged in a number of action research projects within our own educational settings over the course of our 2 years together. Next slide, please. Okay, so for these projects, I started with topics that felt relatively safe to me. So collaborating with another teacher to increase the homeschool connection and implementing flexible seating, as you can see here. And for my big end of year or end of program project, I really wanted to push myself once again to go outside of my comfort zone. Next slide, please. So I decided to facilitate a youth participatory action research project with my 5, 6, and 7-year-old students, most of whom were English learners. And based on the research at that time, I couldn't find any published evidence of this type of project being done with students who were so young. This project brought together so much of what I had learned. I had to put aside any assumptions or beliefs that young children might not be as capable as older children. I had to focus on relationship building more than ever if I was going to challenge the kids to do this hard work. And I had to take what I had learned about culturally relevant pedagogy and put it into action with this project. So the students amaze me every day, and I'll never forget when Janice told me that I and my students could do hard things. This quote has become a back pocket motto for me as I continue along my transformational journey. It was hard supporting those young learners with data collection and analysis, which is what they're doing in these pictures, all while continuing to teach the required state and county curricula. But through this project, every child in my class had access with the appropriate scaffolds to deep learning, critical and creative thinking, problem solving, application, and this project alone was transformational, not only for them, their self-esteem, communication skills, and social emotional well-being, but also for me as a teacher and, more importantly, a learner. Next slide, please. Marina, it was a really fun project. They made a video at the end where they proposed how their findings from their research. It was great. So we can do hard things. Now, almost 5 years later, I carry this same motto with me each day. Teachers' plates are overflowing, especially during this time of crisis. And now, more than ever, education really needs to experience a shift. All things done with an equity lens. And it can feel like this is just another thing or like a buzzword that a school, county, state is asking of teachers when, in fact, equity is the thing. So as I work with teachers, teams, my school's administration, and other colleagues in the county, I challenge myself to bring this with me to all that I do. It's not easy at times, and often it's uncomfortable. But I work hard to build relationships and honor the time it takes to do so that the hard work can be done. And by doing hard things, stepping outside my comfort zone, I'm better able to truly perceive the kids, their families, my colleagues, and help others to do so as well. Next slide, please. So as I begin to wrap up, it's important for me to note that none of this could have happened without the time and consistency provided by the structure of the Transformative Teaching Program. As a member of a tight-knit cohort led by the same 3 professors over 2 years, I was able to step further out of my comfort zone than I ever thought possible. I formed strong bonds with my colleagues, and clearly I'm still in touch with my professors. The semesters were intentionally planned to build upon one another, and the time together made it possible for my transformation to begin. So these things, time, relationships, identity, are particularly important for equity work. We have to be able to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And we can't get comfortable with being uncomfortable if we don't feel a sense of safety or connection with those around us, which of course takes time to build. And that again speaks to that psychological safety. Next slide, please. So in closing, my transformational journey is just that. It's a journey. For me, this type of growth, exploration, and deep reflection couldn't happen from a one-off workshop or professional development session. It takes time, years, strong relationships, and a willingness to confront challenges and recognition that growth comes out of mistakes and discomfort. My transformational journey that I'm still on today has allowed me to open my eyes so that I can see the kids, their families, and my colleagues. There's still much work to do, and it's possible when we can see the kids. Thanks.
So at this point, we'd like to entertain any questions you have and possibly answer them. Do we want to go to the next slide?
Yeah, we could do that.
Yeah,
Just
I mean,
while we're answering questions, we can.
Right. I mean, one of the biggest questions, of course, is the fact that we're pushing up against 400 plus years of structural racism. And so as we talk about the sort of action and policy responses to that, as well as the sort of small p ways that we can transform policy and eliminate racism, we invite you, among the questions you might have, to think about how you might advocate for a different type of anti-racist professional development for educators in the 21st century, and where there are spaces where you can put these elements into practice in your own context. So even as you have questions for us, we have this question for you to consider.
And you're welcome to unmute your mic and talk to us.
Right.
You don't have to write it in the chat.
All right.
Quick question. Do you support higher ed professional development as well? Or how do you see the scaffolding or the training needs as different or similar, whether you're supporting someone to go into a classroom with 8-year-olds versus 28-year-olds?
That's a great question.
Do you want to take that one, Betsy, since you're in the middle of that right now?
Sure. So some of you may know that Mason has a new president, Gregory Washington, and his initiative this first year in his tenure at Mason is all about anti-racism and inclusive excellence. And many of us are doing all kinds of things related to that beyond our program, but there are initiatives within our college, for instance, to use an equity audit like we use to look at our own syllabi, for instance, and to think about our interactions with students in the higher ed space. So, and I do think that the kinds of work that we do fits within any educational space, you know, the kinds of identity work, examining assumptions, building relationships, thinking about leadership and policy. Those are all things that people in higher ed are needing to do as well, and to some extent are doing. So it fits. Our program is not for higher ed individuals, but we're always interested in thinking about expanding to other populations. Denise, do you want to add to that, or Stacia?
I think your response was appropriate. I mean, we're in the middle now, actually, of writing an article that speaks directly to that question of how to do this work in a higher ed space. And it's built not just on our program and the four of us, but also other colleagues in the College of Education and Human Development, or School of Education and Human Development. The name has changed, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and
I'm going to put these links in the chat. Sorry.
Okay, no problem.
And I had another question with the equity audits. Have you thought about, because I could see there's an analytical, reflective learning process, and that could be interviews, stakeholder engagement, or just research. But I could also see that almost like a variant of the cafeteria challenge of like flipping it to open up innovations and ideas and solutions as a result of the assessment and the equity audit. I'm curious, have you found equity audits can lead to new ideas and kind of the solutioning direction? But then B, how can students be involved in equity audits as like a project or a learning, being forced to engage with the critical questions?
Yeah, so I'll take the first part of that question, because that actually is, they do the audit one semester and then we return to it in another semester where they actually create an action plan. So take a piece of the data that you uncovered that's really troubling to you, and then a couple steps. Read about it. What are other people in the world doing about this? This is not, just your school system that's struggling with overrepresentation in special ed of students of color. This is happening, across the nation. So how have other people engaged in this? And then come up with a plan for how are you going to address this in your school? And sometimes in those plans, sometimes it's as early in the process as starting the conversation and let's bring this to the table and let's talk about it. Sometimes there have been real elaborate plans of actions. And I believe sometimes even those actions did include students as part of that process. We haven't, we don't require them or ask of them to bring the students into that, but that audit often influences what they choose to study for their teacher research projects. And so sometimes you see it popping up in those spaces where the students become part of that process as well, because it is a topic that the teacher wants to address further and chooses to do that through teacher research. I'll stop there. Did anybody want to add on?
Lauren, you described your teacher research project, your year-long project, but do you remember your equity audit action research project?
I was just the first action research project. I don't remember what I focus on. I know I worked with, I think I may have done something with the student representation on like the student council, possibly. And I was actually just going to look up on my computer to see if I could find it.
We make them do a lot of work, so it's not
multiple projects.
Right. Because it's a learning loop, it's the spiral where you either keep coming back to the same question from a different angle, or you now have new perspective on that other thing and it takes you in another direction. And so again, that's part of the beauty of this iterative process, this cohort model, this shared teaching. In a lot of university courses, you try to cram everything into a single course, and then you just pray that it sticks, and then something about that will show up in the next course in the sequence, but there's no guarantee if the faculty haven't worked together to make that happen. So, yeah.
And I will add that we should probably say as well, related to the equity audit, that Betsy, Janice, and I, and another colleague of ours from another graduate program at Mason, did get a grant and go into a school and work with a particular school around equity audits. And so it was a team of teachers that did these audits so that they could look at, which included the administrators, so they could look as a school at what they wanted to change. And they created multiple different action projects from that. The pandemic kind of came right at the end of that project, didn't it? Right. So I don't think I can report much on what came of that.
We're still working on it.
Yeah.
That was the end. But we have been talking for years about our desire to really work closely with a particular school system for some of this change, because we see how powerful it is for teachers. And what would that look like if we had a bunch of teachers all from the same setting working together and driving that change? Can be really powerful.
I see your question, Marina, to Becky or Jason concerning equity audits. Is that at the higher ed level? Yeah.
Awesome, in the School of Architecture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think at the higher ed level, it would also include things, it's not just a curricular focus, it would also include things like, how are we doing on hiring? And beyond that, how are we doing on retaining? You know, sort of the kinds of diversity that we say we value. What are we doing about mentoring people to support them through the tenure process, for example? What are we doing to attract a diverse pool of doctoral students and making sure they stick it out? You know, so it's more than just, do we have courses that are called culturally relevant so-and-so, you know? and in those courses, are we building tools and practices for the long haul? It's also sort of the broader context of higher ed.
And given the new president of George Mason having an active interest in this, I think there's just so much potential for GMU to play a leadership role in terms of what this actually looks like for higher ed and institutions. So it'll be so interesting to see what new ideas and new cultures and new policies and practices. But do you think, do you have a sense of what that process will look like, or it's more commitment and over the next several years, you know, more will emerge?
There's a task force that I'm actually a member of. I'm co-chairing one of the committees. And that started last September or so. And each of the committees came up with different lists of proposals related to their area. Mine was community and campus and community engagement. Others are doing curriculum, research, policies and practices, training. So there's a lot of interest, and there are over 100 people on this task force, faculty, staff, and students. And not only is that committee working at the higher level of across the university, but every college is sort of mandated to come up with an equity plan by the university, by President Washington. And so we have in our college 6 members, I think it is, of an equity team that's coming up with an equity plan. And it does include issues about faculty retention, as well as marketing to the right places, and having search committees that are well trained to recognize their implicit bias and all kinds of things. So it's early days yet, and it will be a test of our commitment to doing this work to see if it actually pans out into the actions that we're all talking about needing to take. Because for one thing, it requires funding, and funding is always the bottom line and also the crux of the challenge.
Right, but I would say, Betsy, even before that, it requires will, because you can do a lot with no money if you have the will. Right. So I think I agree that more resources are welcome. If people don't want it to happen, it won't happen, you know, and no matter how many resources there are. And I think that's the first place to begin. And you can't manufacture will, but I think the incentives for why it's important to care about these issues need to be more explicit, so that people can understand, oh, this is in my long-term interest and in the long-term interest of this institution to do this thing. And then the money will come.
And also building coalitions of people who are building power through those engagements, and figuring out how to use that power in positive ways. culture, conversations, and awareness can happen for free. Yes,
Absolutely.
and we are working on that. So I did put in the chat the name of our book and a link to an article that came out recently about our program, and the name of our program and my contact information if anybody's interested in learning more about our program, Transformative Teaching Program at Mason.
Thank you so much, everybody. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marina.
Thank you.